I don't say this lightly, but this might be the best crossover event I have ever played in a gacha game, and the strange part is, I expected it to be good. Wuthering Waves promised a lot with the Edgerunner collab, the trailers looked great, the presentation looked expensive, and this is Kuro, so at this point expecting them to cook is not exactly unreasonable. But even then, I was not ready for what this event had in store for me. Somewhere, while playing through the story, I stopped thinking of it as a crossover, and I started thinking, wait, is this actually an epilogue? That's what surprised me most, not just the production value, even though the production value is insane. The part that really got me is that this collab doesn't feel like it was made just to celebrate Edgerunners. It feels like it was made to continue it. And that is not something I expect from a gacha crossover. Usually, collabs are fun side content, but this is different. So the question I kept coming back to after finishing it was pretty simple. How did Wuthering Waves take something that should have been just a crossover event and make it feel like one of the most emotional stories Kuro has told so far? I think the answer starts with the biggest reason this event feels so unusual. It doesn't behave like a collab. Most crossover events have a very specific feeling, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Usually they are fun, they are exciting. They let you see characters from one world appear inside another world, maybe fight some enemies, maybe share a few emotional moments, and then everyone politely returns to where they came from. It's basically the gacha version of, thanks for visiting, please buy the skin. And honestly, that's fine. That's what collaborations are usually built to do. They're not normally supposed to feel essential or carry the emotional weight of the original story, but that's also why this collab caught me so off guard. At first, I was still looking at it like a crossover. I was expecting references, familiar characters, not to mention high production value since this is Wuthering Waves, and Kuro clearly wanted this event to be a big deal. But the more the story kept going, the more it started feeling like the wrong way to look at it. Because this event does not just bring Edgerunners into Wuthering Waves, it follows the emotional aftermath of Edgerunners. That's the difference that makes the whole event feel so unusual. It's not just asking, what if Lucy and Rebecca appeared in Wuthering Waves? That would have been the normal collab version. Instead, the story is asking something much more specific. What happens after the ending? What is left behind? What does someone do with all that grief, memory and trauma when the story is technically already over? That is when the event started clicking for me. Because it's not using Edgerunners as decoration, it's using Edgerunners as history. The characters don't feel like guest stars who showed up for a limited event. They feel like people carrying the weight of a story that already happened. That's a very different kind of crossover. It means the event has to do more than just be cool. It has to respect what came before. It has to understand why people cared about these characters in the first place. And somehow, that's exactly what Kuro tried to do. Not just with big emotional scenes, but with the way the entire event is framed. The Somnoire is not just a convenient excuse to put cyberpunk characters into Wuthering Waves. It becomes a space where memory, loss and unfinished emotion can actually exist. That's what makes the collab feel so much more serious than I expected. It gives the story a reason to happen, not just a crossover reason, an emotional reason. And that is probably the first moment where I realized this event was aiming much higher than I thought. If this was just a normal collaboration, good production value would have been enough, good music would have been enough, seeing the characters again would have been enough. But Wuthering Waves does something much more interesting. It treats the collab like an aftermath. And once you realize that, the whole event starts feeling less like a side story and more like an epilogue the anime never had. But that also creates a much harder challenge, because if you are going to continue something as emotionally heavy as Edgerunners, you cannot just rely on nostalgia, you have to understand the wound you are touching. The part that makes this event so dangerous is that continuing Edgerunners is not easy. Actually, it's probably one of the easiest things to get wrong. If you make it too light, it feels disrespectful. If you make it too nostalgic, it becomes empty fan service. If you try too hard to fix the ending, you risk weakening the thing that made the anime hurt in the first place. So the question is, how do you continue a story like that without taking away its weight? Well, we don't have to look much further for the answer since the entire episode is basically Kuro's response to it. They don't use the Edgerunner's pain like a secondary thing, they treat it like something Lucy still has to carry. That difference matters because the story is not built around pretending the past can be undone, it's built around what remains after the past already happened. That's why the whole Somnoire setup works so well here. On paper, it could have felt like a convenient crossover excuse, a dreamlike space where characters from another world can appear. Easy, done. Congratulations, we have a collab. But the event uses that space for something much more emotional. The Somnoire becomes a place where memory can take shape, where grief can become visible, where the people Lucy lost can appear again, not because the story is trying to undo what happened, but because those memories still exist inside her. And that is such a smart way to handle this, because the event gets to bring those characters back without making it feel cheap. Rebecca can be here, David can matter, Lucy can face pieces of her past again, but the story still understands that this is not a clean reunion. There is something painful underneath it, something unfinished. And even as someone who had not watched the anime before playing this, I could feel that. Even though I thought I would be missing too much context, I thought this would be one of those collabs where existing fans get the full emotional experience and everyone else just gets the basic version. But that's not what happened. The event gives you enough to understand that Lucy is not simply meeting old friends again, she is moving through memories that still hurt. And because of that, the emotional weight still works even if you are not coming in with 10 episodes of trauma already loaded into your brain. Very considerate of Kuro, by the way. They saw people who had not watched Edgerunners yet and said, "Don't worry, we can emotionally damage you too," and they did. So yes, I'm sure people who watched the anime experienced the story differently, probably more painfully, probably with a lot more context behind every scene. But what impressed me is that the event still works even without that. Lucy's silence works, Rebecca's energy works, the way the story slowly reveals what this space actually represents works. And once you realize that this is not just a crossover setting, but a space built from loss, the event becomes much heavier. That's where the collab stops feeling like content. It starts feeling like aftermath. That is the biggest reason it hit me as hard as it did. Kuro did not try to make Edgerunners less painful. They understood that the pain was the point, and instead of running away from that, they built the entire event around it. But there is another layer here that I did not expect at all, because depending on whether you watch the anime or not, this story changes shape completely, and somehow, both versions work. I keep saying this again and again, because it's true, but this is where the event surprised me again. First, I assumed there was a correct way to experience this collab. You watch Cyberpunk Edgerunners first, then you play the event. That sounds obvious, right? It's a continuation of that story, so of course the anime should come first, and I still think that's probably the more emotional version. If you watch the anime, you already know what Lucy lost, you already know what David means, you already know why Rebecca being here is painful before the story even fully explains it. So from the very beginning, you are not really asking, can these characters be saved? You are asking something much heavier. Can Lucy move forward? That's one version of the story, and it's probably devastating. But what I did not expect is that the event also works if you did not watch the anime, because then the story becomes something completely different. It becomes a mystery. You enter the event seeing these characters, these memories, these fragments of another world, and you don't fully know what happened yet. At first, it almost feels like there might still be a way to save them. Maybe David can be reached, maybe Rebecca is still there somehow, maybe this dreamlike space is not only memory, but possibility. And because you don't already know the full truth, the story pulls you forward in a different way. You are not watching Lucy deal with an ending you already understand, you are slowly discovering that the ending already happened, and that changes everything. As the event goes on, you start realizing what the Somnoire really is. You start realizing that this is not just some crossover dimension where everyone can meet again. It's something built from Lucy's memories, from her grief, from the people she lost. And by the time the story makes that clear, the emotion hits in a very different way. For anime fans, the pain comes from recognition. For new players, the pain comes from realization. And I think that is genuinely impressive, because most collabs struggle to balance those two audiences. If the story leans too hard on existing knowledge, new players feel lost. If it explains too much, existing fans feel like the story is wasting time telling them things they already know. But here, the event somehow finds a middle ground. It gives enough context for new players to care, but it does not flatten the experience for people who already know the anime. Both groups get a story, just not the exact same story. And I don't know if every part of that was intentional. Maybe some of it just happened because the structure was strong enough to support both readings. But if it was intentional, then honestly, that is kind of genius. because it means the event does not only respect Edgerunners as a story, it also respects the fact that not everyone enters the story from the same place. Some people come in carrying the wound already, others discover the wound as they go. But either way, the event makes sure you feel it. That's not easy, and it's probably the clearest sign that this collab was built with a ridiculous amount of care. Still, the writing is only one part of why it worked. What really sold the emotion, at least for me, was how far Wuthering Waves' presentation has come. This is where the event makes its final argument, because the writing gives the story its shape, but the scenes themselves are what make it work. The more I think about this event, the more I realize how much of it works because Kuro did not rush the important moments. They let the characters breathe, they let scenes sit, and they let small interactions matter before the story reaches the big emotional payoff. You can see that from the way Lucy and Rebecca are introduced into the Wuthering Waves world. Rebecca especially could have been handled as pure chaos, and to be fair, she is chaos. Beautiful, dangerous, emotionally unstable chaos. But the story also lets her interact with the cast in a way that makes her feel strangely natural here. She gets along with people faster than I expected, even Sigrika, which genuinely caught me off guard. But the interaction that stood out to me most was with Linnea, because on the surface, it's fun. Rebecca's energy bounces really well off Linnea, and their scenes are entertaining on a basic character level. But underneath that, there is a smarter reason for putting them together. Linnea has lived the kind of life that Rebecca and Lucy understand. She knows what it means to survive in a brutal world. She knows what it means to carry damage and still keep moving. So when she interacts with them, it does not feel random. It feels like the story found the right person in Wuthering Waves to meet these characters. That is the kind of detail that makes this collab feel carefully built, not just inserted. And then you have Lucy's apartment scene. That scene is slow, very slow. You walk to the space where she lived with David, and the story just lets her remember. It doesn't rush to the next fight. It doesn't panic because there has not been action for a few minutes. It trusts the silence, the environment, the music, Lucy's voice, and the small details of that apartment. That's exactly what I mean when I say Wuthering Waves used everything it has learned about storytelling here. You are not just being told that Lucy is grieving, you are walking through the shape of that grief. And then the event brings all of that to the moon. That final scene with Lucy, Rebecca and David hit much harder than I expected. And again, I'm saying this as someone who had not watched the anime before playing the event. Even without full context, the emotion is so raw that you understand what this moment means. Lucy finally gets to see David again, Rebecca is there too, and the whole scene carries this feeling that is both beautiful and painful because you know this is not a rescue, it is a goodbye. That's what makes it work. The story does not try to undo the loss, it gives Lucy a moment to face it, to say goodbye and move forward. And because we also spend time with Rebecca inside this event, her disappearance hurts too, not only because of what she means to Lucy and David, but because of the bond the event itself built between her and us. By the time she disappears, this event has made her matter here too. And then Lucy has to leave. She has to wake up from this dream, go back to her own world, and return to the life waiting for her. I do have one small nitpick here. The whole "she cannot remember what happened because it might affect both worlds" explanation is probably the one part that felt a little unnecessary to me. I've seen that kind of thing in other collabs before, and I really don't love it. But even then, I don't think it ruins the ending, because the story still shows that something carried over. Even if Lucy does not remember everything clearly, the experience still mattered, the emotion still reached her, and that final image of her back on the moon makes that clear. That's why this event works so well for me. It takes the time to make the characters feel alive inside the story. It lets Rebecca connect with the world. It lets Lucy sit with her memories. It lets the final goodbye hurt. And it does all of that with the kind of care I usually expect from Wuthering Waves' best main story episodes. That's why I keep coming back to the same thought. This should have been just a collab. A very good collab, sure, but still a collab. Instead, it became an epilogue, a story about memory, grief, connection, and finally being able to move forward. And that's why I think this is the best crossover event I have ever played. Not because it was simply cool to see those characters again, but because at some point it stopped feeling like content. It felt like a story that actually mattered. So what do you think? Did the Edgerunners collab hit as hard for you as it did for me? And if you watched the anime, did this feel like a real epilogue to you? Or if you didn't watch it, did the event still manage to make you care about Lucy, Rebecca, and everything this story was built around? Again, Kuro cooked with this one. Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.